And I think that John's got everybody else
Yeah, we're live now, so the audience
available over there
is joining us, and this is all live streaming now.
Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Katz. I'm with the GMF, German Marshall Fund. I'm a senior fellow and also manage the Frontlines of Democracy Initiative. I want to welcome everybody today to this virtual event. Really pleased that you could join us from so many places around the globe. It's great that you could be here for this event. First thing I wanted to do just before we started was just to do a little bit of housekeeping. But first and foremost, I want to say that I hope that everyone is safe in these unsettled times. And so it's meaningful that you could be here to join us. As I mentioned, I'm GMF. I'm GMF's senior fellow, focusing on democracy, civil society, media issues. Great to have you here. Many of you have been joining these type of virtual events over the last couple of weeks. What we're going to try to do as our speakers are speaking, and they're the only ones that will be able to speak, we're going to have everyone on mute. This is an on-the-record event. It's also being live streamed as well, so you can join us that way if you want to. What we're going to do is we have a Q&A function. I'll prompt you when it's time for Q&A. It's at the top of your Zoom page. And after following our speakers, we'll ask that you join in then to provide Q&A. First thing I want to do, because this is such a timely conversation, I want to hand it over to GMF's president, Karen Donfrey. Thank you, Karen, for joining us today for this important conversation. And I think, as all of you know, GMF has really been stepping up in many different ways. And we're really pleased to partner today with RFERL, who, along with Jamie Fly, who's the president, and also their services, has been doing an amazing job at informing publics around the world about what's taking place with respect to the coronavirus. And this event is really focused on their work on the front lines of ensuring that there's communication with populations, many of which live in spaces where there is not information available, both at the national or local level. And they're also on the front lines dealing with issues such as disinformation and protecting human rights and free media. Karen, if I could just hand it over to you to kick this off, but also to introduce our first speaker, Jamie Fly. Karen, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. And Jonathan, so grateful for all the important work you're doing here at GMF on these issues. A warm welcome to all of you who are tuning in. I'm delighted you're taking the time this morning for this important conversation. We're looking at how you report a pandemic, and our good friends at RFERL are doing tremendous work in terms of protecting media freedom and human rights during the coronavirus. And I don't think we can overstate the importance of their work exactly at this moment. They are on the front lines reporting in environments where independent news is not a given and where the need for accurate assessments of the situation is crucial. So I'm so grateful to Jamie Fly and his colleagues for taking the time this morning to have this conversation with a broader audience. I also want to highlight that colleagues here at GMF are also contributing to this area of how do we preserve press freedom, how do we fight against disinformation. So I want to also encourage you to look at the work of our Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative, which has put out new reports on safeguarding democracy against disinformation. They've also put out a report on 5 steps to combat the infodemic, as well as the work that our Alliance for Securing Democracy has been doing, with they're trying to put a spotlight on disinformation, whether from Russia or from China. And that's actually a very nice segue to Jamie Fly, because Jamie, before stepping into his current role as RFERL's president, was a colleague of mine here at GMF and actually co-directed the Alliance for Securing Democracy, among many other responsibilities that he had here at GMF. Prior to GMF, he worked on Capitol Hill. He worked for Senator Marco Rubio, also on his presidential campaign. He used to run an organization called the Foreign Policy Initiative. He's worked in the executive branch, both at the White House and at the Department of Defense. So he brings just an incredible amount of experience to his current role at RFERL. And Jamie, with that, I'd love to pass the baton to you. And thank you so much for being part of this conversation this morning. Over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Karen. It's great to see former GMF colleagues, at least virtually, back in DC, continuing GMF's mission during these times. And thanks to Jonathan for pulling everything together. So I thought I'd just start off with a brief kind of overview of who we are in normal times at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and how we've been responding to the current challenges. And then a number of my colleagues are going to talk specifically about some of our language services and the situation as we see it in three of one region and two other countries where we operate. We cover 26 languages currently across Eurasia. We're a news organization that's funded by the US Congress annually. And our mission is really to do surrogate journalism in markets where it otherwise would not exist. So these are places across Eurasia where press freedom sometimes doesn't exist at all, or it's under significant stress. Where sometimes people have to turn to state outlets for their news and information, or, which is an increasing trend in many of places we operate, media has really been purchased by oligarchs and others with certain agendas. And so there's not really a vibrant media space where people have a diversity of options that they can go to get objective news and information. And so we take a market by market approach. We provide news and information in local languages so that people are able to access objective news and information about any issue in normal times. And obviously in recent weeks and months, we've been focused significantly on coronavirus, which I'll talk more about in a minute. I stress the local because we are on the ground. We have 20 bureaus across our coverage area. And as much as possible, we want to be able to have our journalists in country reporting on issues locally, telling people stories that they can interact with as they collect those stories and show them to the rest of the audience. And so that's our priority. And that also gives us unique insight into what's going on the ground in many of the places we operate. Finally, I'd just say we are a multimedia organization, a news organization, despite the radio still being in our name. It's an important part of our heritage. We still do some radio in many markets, but we also do a significant amount of TV on a daily basis across our markets, and increasingly are engaged in digital news gathering in some cases, and then also using pretty much every digital platform imaginable across the 22 countries in which we operate to provide news and information. Finally, I'll just mention a small connection to Germany, given the German Marshall Fund's role. We actually spent most of our history operating out of headquarters in Munich, Germany. Most of our Cold War time was spent there, and we moved to Prague 25 years ago, actually this year, at the invitation of then Czech President Václav Havel. But the time this organization spent in Germany during the Cold War, I think really helped shape its mindset. And we even have employees who are still working with us to this day who started off their careers in Munich at headquarters. And so that's an important part of our legacy. So how have we been responding to the coronavirus? Obviously, first and foremost, we've had to find ways to continue to do our journalism despite the closures we're seeing in many countries. Also here in Prague, where we have about half of our staff at headquarters, we've been under a state of emergency for a little over 3 weeks now. And obviously the media operating environment, which in many of these countries is not always friendly to journalists, has gotten even unfriendlier in some cases. And so we've been tracking that very closely. But what we found in the last several weeks is that our audiences really have made clear that they have a need for basic information about a pandemic like the one we're experiencing. They obviously still are interested in politics and commentary and the things that we often provide in many markets. But what they're also saying they need more than ever is just basic health information, something that they're not getting from other media sources in many of these countries. Basic facts about what they're facing the truth about the origins of this pandemic and how it's spreading. I mean, these are all the types of reporting that we've been doing across all of the markets in which we operate. A couple things that I think just I can generalize across our markets. Most of our coverage region was a bit behind Western Europe and the US in confronting this crisis head on. It's only really in the last several weeks that many of the governments where we operate have been putting in place preventive measures like states of emergency, or starting to pivot in their public messaging. So I think it's still early in many of the countries where we have bureaus and where we report on a daily basis in terms of gauging the full society impact of this crisis. A couple examples which you may have followed either from our reporting or others. In Belarus, government leaders, including Lukashenko, have often seemed to scoff at coronavirus and play down whether it's a threat. Russia, the Russian Federation, went through a kind of quick pivot just in the last week to 10 days. Up until then, a lot of state media were really playing down the pandemic. And now, obviously, they've put in place strict measures across Russia, which Andrei Shari can talk a little bit more about. In Central Asia, we've seen similar reactions. In some Central Asian states, they still have tried to insist, like Tajikistan, that there's not a single case in the country, despite many suspicious deaths. Just 2 or 3 weeks ago, they were still holding large-scale rallies and celebrations of events like Nowruz. In Turkmenistan, I think it was only in recent days, initially the government, that they've even started to admit there's a problem. The government initially banned the use of the word coronavirus, I think, before pivoting again in recent days. And so that sort of reaction has been, unfortunately, the case across much of Eurasia. Second thing we're seeing is a disinformation-heavy environment, and this is something I know that others at GMF have tracked very closely. We're obviously seeing the standard Russian and Iranian disinformation, especially about the origin of the coronavirus, spreading conspiracy theories about a supposed US role, or US military role in maybe initially bringing the virus to China. And we've seen that story, like I said, parroted by Russian state media and then also Iranian officials. Even more recently, though, we've seen an uptick across our coverage area in Chinese disinformation. Some of this has embraced the same sorts of conspiracy theories that the Russians and Iranians have been pushing for quite some time. But a lot of the Chinese disinformation has been more focused on highlighting their own struggles with the virus, but obviously presenting a very optimistic picture of how they've responded to the coronavirus. And then also highlighting their various soft power efforts just in the last really week, 1 to 2 weeks, to send supplies to hard-hit areas of Europe, and also to places like the Czech Republic, where I sit now, in using photo ops, using the kind of imagery of leaders meeting Chinese planes at the airport. And this is something I think we've seen from the Czech Republic to Hungary, and also to Serbia, to name just a few. A third kind of concerning trend that we've seen across our coverage area has been increased pressure on journalists. I mentioned that across the countries in which we normally operate, it's often a difficult operating environment, given government pressure against the press. My fear now is that we're seeing many governments use this crisis as an opportunity to justify measures that they've put in place in the past, and actually to expand those measures to increase restrictions on journalists. In our case, we've seen a little bit of that with kind of alternative accreditation regimes being set up. We obviously, wherever we have people, try to comply with local regulations about accreditation of journalists. We've now seen, when states of emergency have been instituted, that in some cases, new ministries are put in charge of accrediting journalists to allow them to move around the city or the countryside to cover this issue. And in some cases, governments have indicated that they'll give preference to state-sponsored media, that independent media may not have access to the same freedom of movement as other state-sponsored journalists, and that's concerning. We've also seen a number of legislative proposals, in some cases where the legislation is actually passed, where so-called fake news about coronavirus is criminalized. And so journalists theoretically could be targeted under this legislation for just publishing the facts. If a government is in denial about basic information about the spread of the virus, about the way that the public health infrastructure is responding or failing to respond, that journalist could actually be prosecuted under some of this legislation. And we've seen discussion of this or different proposals in places like Belarus, Russia. There was a debate about this in Serbia, I believe, and Arbana can talk more about this in a few minutes. And then we've also seen it in a market that we're hoping to return to in the next several months, not too far from here in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, as part of the emergency measures that the Orban government pushed through Parliament. So that's another disturbing trend. One positive note that I'll end on that I think we've seen across all of the markets in which we operate is that we've seen an increase in our numbers. So our audiences, maybe because many of them are now under lockdown and homebound and lacking other things to do, are increasingly coming and engaging with our content, especially online, obviously, where across our markets, people increasingly get most of their news and information. And so we're hoping that we can play a positive role during this period, despite the pressures, despite the challenges we have as our staff try to find ways to continue their work, whether it's from home or those who have to come into the studio in a safe way. But we do think we're playing an important role at this moment when across Eurasia, people are desperate for basic facts, objective information that they can't otherwise get in their countries. And so to talk a little bit more about how we're tackling this challenge in several of our regions, you're going to hear from Andrei Shari, who's our Russian service director, Arbana Vidashiki, who's our Balkan service director, and then Ivan Bedrov, who's our Bulgarian service director. All three of them are based here in Prague, but have extensive experience in their region. And each can kind of tackle this from a different angle, given the different situations in each of those places. But before we turn it over to Andre, I think I'm going to kick it back to Karen.
Jamie, thank you so much. That was a terrific overview of the work that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is doing. And it was really interesting to hear how your role has changed during the coronavirus crisis. We're really excited to hear from your colleagues. And I'm going to turn to my colleague, Jonathan Katz, to take the conversation from here and play that moderating role. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Karen. And thank you, Jamie, too, for that overview. And I think you really did point out some of the key challenges in coronavirus reporting and some of the on-the-ground changes that certain governments are taking in terms of legislation or cracking down on independent media. So I think it's so important, the work you're doing. And in your opening monologue, opening conversation, you mentioned Russia. And of course, both here in Washington and elsewhere, there's a great deal of focus on Russia right now, not only what's happening internally, but what's happening externally in terms of disinformation, but also challenges. And I think there's a great concern about what's happening on the ground, knowing that citizens there may not be getting accurate or timely information. It was interesting that you mentioned a shift in how the government was responding. And I think that brings us right to over to your colleague, Andrei Shari, who has been focused on this and is both him along with others on the ground. Andrei, can I just bring you in right now and really, obviously Russia is at the center, has been at the center of many challenges for the United States and the West over the last several years. The coronavirus adds a new layer to that, but most important, when you have a moment where there are health concerns in Russia too, and the Russian public needs to know, and you have a government that is prone to controlling media, controlling press. Maybe tell us a little bit about what you see happening on the ground and how you are operating, your colleagues are operating in this very difficult environment. Andre, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everybody. I like to welcome everybody in this wonderful discussion. These questions are obviously very important, and just a couple of words about what we are doing. What is the Russian service of RFERL? We have very heavy presence in Russia with a bureau with around 100 journalists strong, and with a wide network of correspondents all over Russia, which provides info not only for our main website, but for a whole family of the websites which are devoted especially for local audience in Siberia, for example, or northwest of Russia. So having people on the ground, it does mean that we can prove given information which is given by Russian authorities, and in some cases we can prove whether it's false or not, and how the situation looks not from the eyes of Kremlin-sponsored TV media, but as it looks in the reality. As Jamie mentioned, Russian government initially played down the importance of the coronavirus, portraying this as a thing which is somewhere far away. There were obvious political reasons for that, at least two of them. First is that Vladimir Putin is intending to prolong his presidency for a long period of time, and Kremlin planned constitutional referendum, a kind of constitutional referendum for April 22nd. So, and of course, this possible quarantine regime could spoil all Kremlin plans. Another issue is that one of the backbones of Russian identity as seen by Kremlin is their legacy of Second World War, which was exclusively, as Kremlin thinks, won by Russians. And for 9th of May, it was planned a huge military parade and festivities in Moscow and all over the country. So also it's impossible to be held if some restriction measures will be put over Russian citizens during that time. But 10 days ago, it became obvious that coronavirus is very important and potentially very dangerous for Russia also. Nobody knows whether statistics which is provided by Russian authorities to World Health Organization is false or true. Officially, there are over around 6,500 of infected people, and the rate of mortality is rather slow with around 50 people. So it's very hard to tell whether it's true or not, and whether what Russian authorities are doing to confront coronavirus is enough to save the population. Nevertheless, during the last week, severe measures of restrictions are held in Russia, especially in Moscow region. There is practically a state of emergency, which is not called by state TV a state of emergency. It provokes a lot of question whether it was done by Mr. Putin and his force according to the constitution or not. But actually, people are self-isolated in their houses. There is a kind of whole month which is officially holidays month, so, and nobody knows exactly who will pay for people who are in the necessities to spend their time at homes now. But nevertheless, it puts all Russia and independent journalism in Russia in the situation which is very popular now, a situation of ideal storm, when you have we have difficulties with providing balanced and fact-check journalism from one point of view, and from other side you have all these potential dangers connected with coronavirus. A good example is how our journalists are now working on the ground, because we have bureau in Moscow, as I've said, and separations are limited, but we do provide all our content in different ways. For example, several of our video talk shows are now done completely in remote mode. Journalists are sitting in homes and provide what they have been provided before from the studios. They do it at home. We try to be as much aggressive, positively aggressive on the field, on the ground, to check whether it's enough medical supplies, medical equipment, and given medical centers all over Russia, because situation differs from region to region. Nevertheless, Russian government seems to plan several new measures which can oppress possibilities for journalists to operate freely in Russia, because there are a number of different legislation practices which already prevents journalists of getting information from state officials. Now there are a couple of new legislative initiatives like possible criminal offense for the people who are providing what is called by Russian government fake news about coronavirus. There are a couple of cases with bloggers, with independent bloggers from around the country. But now situation is like this, that I would say mostly people are waiting what will be there. So there is a feeling that their momentum of coronavirus has not been come into Russia, because, for example, today's rate of people who are infected is over 15% of the whole rate. So around 1,000 people have been infected during or tested infected during the last 24 hours only. So it does mean that we have bigger challenges in front of us, not behind. So we'll closely moderate the situation. We'll see what will going on. But I have a feeling that Russian government has a very big challenge connected with what will be economical price of all of this. Russia is not so mighty economically as United States, European Union. And the question who will pay the price for coronavirus and those restrictions which had been made by Russian authorities has been already raised by a number of very important NGOs and opposition political leaders. There are no answers to this question. And we live now very terrific and interesting and challenging time. Over.
Thank you, Andrei. It's important to hear what you were saying about what's happening on the ground, and that it sounds to me like Russia may be actually a couple weeks behind, or we don't really know, but could be a couple weeks behind where the U.S. is. Big country with big cities as well. And we'll come back to you too on sort of the question of regions, of local news, and who's able to hear what, planning. But I think you raised the point that at the end of the coronavirus, there may be some political prices to pay. And I wanted to come back to you on that too, because it seems like there's a new figure who has emerged as the focal, the leading face of combating coronavirus in Russia. And so I want to come back to you on that and answer that question. But I wanted to turn next to your colleague. And I wanted to move over to Arbana to talk about the Western Balkans as well. Arbana, the Western Balkans is also, there's multiple countries that are dealing with this crisis. Most of them are small, are challenged economically to begin with, are at a crossroads too. Many are seeking to join the European Union or NATO. There's a direct connection to the EU, but there's also been some criticism of the EU and Western partners in support of, for example, Serbia. And so I really want to just turn to you, because you've got a diverse portfolio of people on the ground in multiple countries, but the Balkans has challenging issues already to begin with, as I mentioned, economically and politically. It's also been a ground for a number of malign influencers including the Kremlin, Chinese as well. That's not the only actors there. Can you bring us into view in terms of what's happening in the Western Balkans? And again, thank you, Andre, but also Arbana for being here too, as you are working with a number of people on the ground in a very challenging environment. Arbana, I'm going to turn it over to you right now for your opening statement.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good afternoon, everybody from Prague. At times of crisis, like the COVID-19 pandemic, it's probably natural for nations around the world not to question much the decision of their governments, of their leaders. It's a survival instinct, I guess. But that's where it gets problematic, tricky for most of the countries of Western Balkans. These are partly free societies in terms of democracy development, media freedom, and are usually ranked higher on the corruption perception annual reports. State of emergency has been introduced in most of them, meaning that in some cases, the state of emergency might even serve as an excuse of putting basic human rights on hold. All 5 countries where RFERL broadcasts in the Western Balkans, that is Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, North Macedonia, and Montenegro, are due to hold elections sometimes this year, or whenever the virus paves a way for them to be held. So whoever wins the pandemic war will mostly win the elections. That victory is being outlined now as we speak. In this regard, the journalists in all these countries face certain hardships in obtaining information of public interest when it comes to the coronavirus outbreak in different areas and different levels in these countries. In Serbia, for example, you cannot obtain the number of ventilators or tests available for that matter, as this information is qualified as state secret. Serbia also introduced and then retracted 8 hours later a special decree which allowed information related to the coronavirus outbreak to be published only if it came from the National Crisis Management Task Force. That meant that journalists had to, if you had a story from a doctor, from a nurse in the hospital, you have to first get the permission from the Crisis Management Task Force before you could publish it, if at all. That's Kosovo, which is currently engulfed in double crisis, the coronavirus and the government crisis. The political parties can't agree on how to proceed. A couple of weeks back, the Kosovo government fell down. And now each political party is pushing the internal agenda by using the pandemic as an excuse. And then there's the interethnic card, which is usually very powerfully played in Western Balkans in times of crisis. When reporting on coronavirus cases, Kosovo authorities have no information whatsoever on how many Serbs from Kosovo have been infected and where are they? Are they getting treatment? Are they under quarantine? Because Kosovo Serbs report their cases to Serbia. It is therefore our duty as RFERL to track those cases, to track different sources and give the whole picture regardless of ethnicity. Or we have the case in Bosnia, for example. Republika Srpska turned to Serbia for help to fight the pandemic. The Croat representatives of Bosnia turned to Zagreb. And the Muslim Bosniaks reached out to Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan for help to fight the pandemic. In fact, in most of these countries, the biggest help comes from the European Union. All of Western Balkans countries got some current aid to fight the virus, and tens of millions of euros have been pledged to help these countries revive their economy after the pandemic ends. Now, the dominant narration, especially in Serbia, which is also supported publicly by official Belgrade, portrays Beijing and Moscow as saviors. The help from EU did come a little with delay compared to the Chinese help. But in terms of value and in terms of the long-term development and economic revival, not only Serbia, but all of the Western Balkans countries, European Union is well far away from China and from Russia. In general, Western Balkans is even now, and it surfaces the troubles it has. It's a troubled region, economically and politically underdeveloped. It's interethnically intolerant. The current pandemic situation will most likely cement these troubles even deeper. Without a strong oversight and support from the West, the East will find its way through. Jonathan?
Thank you. And I think that final point is a reminder too, in sort of this reporting that that this coronavirus is going to have a long-term impact, particularly on countries that have fairly weak economies. And thank you for highlighting the different actors there are that are playing a role in disinformation or information in the region, but also that the Balkans, like many spaces, has there's inter-ethnic relationships that have been built up both internally and externally that are impacting the situation. And I really do appreciate also that you highlighted the role of the EU, and I want to add, obviously, the U.S. government as well, too. I think that the Balkans' Western partners are thinking about how best to support countries in the region. So it's important to know, to have the reporting externally as to what is needed and how it's impacting populations on the ground. I'm going to turn to Ivan right now, just for his reporting, talking about both Bulgaria, Black Sea region. Bulgaria also faces many of the same challenges that its neighbor does as well, and has a great deal of needs. And RFE's reporting in Bulgaria has been essential on the ground at reaching Bulgarians, providing updated information. There's also another challenge that Bulgaria faces, which is the issue of refugees and others that are coming from Turkey, has been dealing with that issue. If I turn it over to you right now, just to also provide your perspective and the on-the-ground perspective in Bulgaria. And I also just want to praise your efforts and your team on the ground, along with your other colleagues who are here today that are providing excellent information and updates and are really connecting on some of these key issues. Ivan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you all of you for this opportunity to talk about our work. So Bulgaria is a little bit different case because the country is member of the European Union and NATO, and we came back 15 months ago to do the things that others are not doing. The media environment is deteriorating, and Bulgaria is ranking 111th place in Reporters Without Borders media freedom ranking. So we came back to report on corruption, to report on rule of law, on the political influence over judiciary, and to counter disinformation. Today we are reporting only about coronavirus. There is no other topic here in Bulgaria, and I did not expect that we should do basic reporting again, and it will be necessary because the media environment is not providing this right now. Concerning numbers, Bulgaria looks comparatively well. There are 549 infected people with 22 death cases so far. The state of emergency was declared on March 13th, so we are living almost a month in the state of emergency. It will be prolonged a month more, and maybe it will stay up to May 13th. But in this situation, we see risks about violating human rights and risks for imposing censorship. I will give a few examples. So when the parliament approved the state of emergency law, there was a text that was approved initially, and it said that big fines and even prison should be imposed for distributing false news about the pandemic. False news may mean a different number. If the authorities claim that we have 100 cases, and if we find out that there are more or less, it can be labeled as false news, and the big fines and even prison the journalist can be punished even with prison. So the president vetoed this text, and now we don't have it. But still, there is a draft law in Parliament submitted to Parliament from the nationalistic coalition part of the government, and they still want to impose big fines and prison for distributing, as they say, false news without any definition of false news. They have raised the sanctions for creating panic. So in the criminal code of Bulgaria, we had a text for creating panic, but now they have raised the sanctions. It may sound justifiable now, but we have a story, we have reported about 2 doctors from a town in southern Bulgaria, and they have been investigating for creating panic just because they have expressed their concerns that their hospital is not ready to fight the pandemic, and now they investigate. So maybe it's still the doctors so far. Maybe tomorrow some journalists will publish some information or some information that will say the same thing, and they can go even to prison. There is another example that in the law for the state of emergency, there is a text providing the police with the right to use traffic data from mobile phones to control the quarantine. Again, it may help in the fight against the coronavirus, but there are 2 problems: that no approval by courts is needed, and that there is no deadline. So when the state of emergency is over, the text giving the police the right to use our traffic data will still be on. So we focused on that issue, we published it, and we played, as I say, the secret agenda setting role that we have to play in Bulgaria. So the next day after our publication, one of the national TV channels on their morning shows, they spent 10 minutes discussing our text and what are the risks. There is another issue apart from human rights. The controlled media environment in Bulgaria is characterized by sensational reporting. People are frightened with headlines. Journalists from mainstream media do not compare data, they just copy and paste what the government is saying. And the result is that the public is confused. So sometimes we need to play a non-traditional role, just explaining and clarifying. For example, there are a number of orders for limitations during the pandemic, and they contradict each other. So in the end of the day, police started imposing fines on people, and people did not know what is legal and what is not legal. So in a situation like this, we just needed to collect all the orders and to publish a short story about you can do this, you cannot do this, and all those pieces they went viral because maybe I think people need and they don't have. In this situation, the propaganda is easily spread. Mainstream media they have lost their critical thinking, and they see that China or Russia's plane in Italy and just report it. Even the Prime Minister has said that we have been left alone by the European Union, and the European Union is not helping us. So again, we had to do some basic fact checking, and it turns out that the European Union has helped Bulgaria with more than 2 billion euros so far. And we have to do things like this just to publish. No, it's not true. The European Union is helping Bulgaria. And just in the end of my expose, something that is really very concerning. Ethnic tensions in Bulgaria is something that stayed behind maybe 15, 12, 20 years ago. But now some of the politicians from the governing coalition, the nationalistic coalition, and even the prosecutor general are pointing at the Roma people in Bulgaria and blaming them for distributing coronavirus. The important thing is that there is absolutely no evidence that the infection rate among Roma community is higher, or they're spreading, or they're not abiding the laws. No such evidence, but they're trying to blame and to create headlines with this. the good news is that so far it does not look successful, but we have a situation like this. So I'll stop here, and if you have any questions later, I'll be glad to answer. Thank you.
Ivan, thank you for that. I think those are really important details that you're providing in terms of those that are being impacted on the ground, or just in terms of how information is to be shared. And one thing that strikes me is this issue of government sort of losing sort of common sense in the moment, or the protection of minorities, which is incredibly important, that we don't throw out rule of law, that we don't throw out media freedom at this moment. Actually, they're quite critical, and short-term responses that don't ensure these things can have a long-term impact way beyond sort of this crisis right now. So I just wanted to thank you for that. Right now, what we're going to do, as I pull back, is we're going to enter into the question session. And if everybody just looks at the top of their screen, I know we've already got some questions so far that have come in, but please send in your questions to our speakers. We'll do our best to get to all of them before the end of the session. I did have one question, and my sort of initial question is to Jamie, bringing him back in if I can. We've heard from a number of speakers about those countries that have highlighted the point that the West or the United States or the EU have not come to the aid of countries. Let's exclude Russia in this moment, but it does include them in another sense. Can you maybe just get a sense? I've seen a very strong reaction in Washington, particularly from Congress, to what's taking place in Hungary. And I think it highlights the point that I think that while people are certainly concerned in the US about the domestic challenges, and that clearly comes first for every government, there's still a great deal of interest to ensure that democracy is not thrown out the window of rule of law. But I just went from your perspective, Jamie, looking at, you're looking across this space and sort of taking in sort of what's taking place. What advice do you have, or what should Washington and others that are focused, clearly the focus on the domestic, but they're also focused on these challenges in spaces like we see in the Balkans, or we're seeing in Russia or Hungary or Turkey. There's certainly an interest in that, but what advice do you have, and how should, what are the resources and things that might be put to good use right now to ensure that at the end of this coronavirus, we hope that there's an end in the sense of we're able to deal with the health aspects of it in the best possible way. But at the end of this process, we don't have several countries across the region that are both economically depressed, but also politically turned further backward, which certainly is not in the interest of anybody, of those that live in these countries, but also partners like the United States and the EU that want us to ensure that these countries remain on the right track, because the healthier they are democratically and economically, politically, the better we're all going to be in the end and able to deal with these challenges. So Jamie, over to you to answer that question.
Thanks. I think it's a disturbing trend we've seen in recent weeks, and with the messaging, especially from, like I mentioned earlier, the Chinese, but also other actors. The Iranians, for instance, have also engaged in this, and a bit of argument with the US publicly about whether or not the US is taking the necessary humanitarian measures to help the Iranian people during this moment. One thing I worry about is that I think far too often people just write off the overt propaganda that we see from some of these authoritarian regimes, and they know the facts. As Ivan was mentioning, just basic information and doing some research will show you that, despite whatever the problems are in Brussels right now, or within the lack of cohesion amongst EU member states, the EU is doing much more for Bulgaria than any other actor. That's even the case in countries that are not EU member states, like Serbia. And so I think a lot of leaders in Brussels and Washington just kind of rest on their laurels and assume that because the facts are in their favor, that no one's going to believe the deliberate misinformation that is being promoted by Beijing or Moscow or Tehran. And I think that's a very dangerous approach because what we've seen, I think, just in the last several weeks is that these things can take hold. This misinformation, especially if there's imagery or symbolism attached to it, with a plane landing at a key moment in a country where they're beginning to grapple with this crisis. It's met by local officials, as was the case here in Prague, when the first flight from China of medical equipment was met by the prime minister standing next to the Chinese ambassador. I think similar scenes played out in Budapest and in Belgrade, among others. Or the Russians have done the same thing with flights to Italy, or even a flight to New York last week. The imagery often is very powerful, even if there's very little to back up that imagery. When journalists, and we've tried to tackle these stories in every single case, when journalists start to pull on the thread, to look into what really was behind that shipment, or whether it was really a donation, or was the country required to pay for it? Was the equipment in some cases actually faulty?
Yeah.
You know, the story starts to fall apart. But most consumers of news in these countries don't necessarily go beyond the imagery. At least they're busy right now. They're trying to deal with this crisis and figure out how to organize their day-to-day lives. And so that's a real challenge. And I think far too many people in Washington and Brussels maybe assume that the facts would just win out. And so that's something that I think, in addition to kind of trying, even as Europe and the US deal with the worst of this crisis and to get equipment for their own health systems, trying to find ways to provide assistance to allies, to form joint partnerships. I know there's some of that going on between the US and European companies on vaccine research. I think these are all things that there need to be more of, and more promotion of those sorts of cooperative activities in this time of need. Because I think without that, the conspiracy theories and the misinformation can often win out.
Jamie, should that include support for, U.S. support for civil society, other independent media, some of your partners that are on the ground that are playing that role? I mean, should we be amplifying sort of that type of support too in this process, or is that not the right direction?
Yeah, I think, from my perspective, and we approach our markets uniquely. Obviously, we're often competing. When there are markets where there are other independent news sources, obviously there are competitors, but I've always said that the more the merrier. I think it's better for our mission when we see vibrant independent media. And so I think US and European partnership in this area is incredibly important. And not just for media, but a lot of this responding can be done by NGOs and think tanks who are doing the real kind of detailed research that needs to be done to highlight the more complex story that you often find. Some of the work being done here in the Czech Republic, some of the best work looking at the Chinese efforts to win over the Czech public, has actually been done by some very small NGOs in recent weeks, who are then able to make their information publicly available to be reported on by news organizations. And so I don't think it's not just independent media, but also NGOs and civil society groups that can actually look into these issues and help highlight what the actual facts are and a lot of the problems with the messages that the authoritarians are trying to send.
Thank you. I've long been an advocate for, sort of ensuring that you guys have at RFERL the resources from the U.S. government side. So I hope that I know we have lots of people listening in from different governments, and hopefully, but particularly in Washington, to support the good work that you and your colleagues are doing, how important it is right now, even in a difficult time, to make this a priority. I wanted to maybe just bring in Arbana and Ivan into the same sort of question about And one of the questions we got was we received from one of someone from who's listening in is Mark Toner. He asked, how can the U.S. and EU do a better job promoting assistance efforts? And I think, interestingly, Jamie, you sort of touched on what I think Mark was asking about, which is whether or not U.S. and EU support has been primarily financial in some spaces, whereas the Chinese and Russians have given physical assistance. Sometimes that assistance, whether it's medical personnel, masks, etc., they deliver it, and it comes in a plane that's highlighted. Russians do a great, I don't know if it's a great job, but they do a job of creating some spin around what they're providing. But really, this is a question for Urbana and Ivan about how can the U.S. and EU do a better job promoting its assistance efforts. Urbana, you mentioned that you think that issue is, and I'll turn to you first, that maybe there's a turning of the corner on how people are seeing what is being provided on the ground by the EU. I'm not sure if the US registers or how it's registering in the Balkans, in Serbia today. But maybe if you could both weigh in on that. And then I wanted to turn to Andre just to ask about how this disinformation is playing out in Russia as well. What are Russians seeing about the Russian approach externally? Because if the challenges are so grave domestically, is this creating any backlash, or is it just so controlled the Russian public doesn't know half of what's being done externally? So Urbana, can I turn to you just to answer one of our audience's question?
Sure. Let's not forget, so the U.S. State Department, the U.S. The State Secretary, Mike Pompeo, earmarked $274 million for 64 countries, Western Balkans countries included. There were some planes that came with help. It's not exclusively financial, so there were some medical aids. I know there was one of them, at least in Bosnia. What I would echo is Jamie's remarks, imagery. Is when 11 planes come from Russia and it says to Serbia and it says it comes with aid, we are not allowed, not allowed, this is not a correct expression. We were not answered when we inquired, did Serbia pay anything for that aid, for that help? Is it totally humanitarian, or is Serbia going to pay for some of the medical personnel that is now going to be stationed in Serbia? So our job is to track that data. It's not easy. We do it on a daily basis. We go to reach out to US sources, websites, official websites, EU, of course, then go and use the laws which are in place specifically in Serbia to fight that narration. And we produce content on a weekly basis which actually debunk what the official narration is, that the biggest help is coming from Moscow or Beijing, which is not true. And these are official data that we heavily rely on. So I think that the more transparency on the aid which is being provided, more publicity from the stakeholders themselves, in this case Washington and Brussels, would help us, the journalists, portray a better picture of who's helping who.
Ivan, you weigh in as well.
Thank you again. It's a little bit different situation in Bulgaria. So the propaganda is distributed mainly online through a number of small online media. And it is not in direct favor of Russia and China. It is against the EU. So nobody is saying, almost nobody is saying in Bulgaria that Russia and China are better than the EU, because it will not work in Bulgaria. But the narratives are attacking the European Union. So the EU failed. This is the headline. And on the other hand, we have a number of stories. For example, that Russian doctors have arrived in Italy, and the next day the pandemic ends. Things like this. and they have thousands and tens of thousands of shares online, and this is distributed everywhere. And one of the questions in the Q&A I saw asked why the leaders are talking like this, because Bulgarian Prime Minister really said that we have been left alone by the EU. It's not because he's anti-European. It's because he wants to be great. He wants to paint the picture that the situation is very difficult and I'm the only one who can solve it. And part of the support, of the financial support that Bulgaria has received from the European Union, the government is presenting as something they have invented. So this is the reason. But it is the attack against the EU. This is the main narrative. The EU failed. It's just like 2015 when the narrative said Merkel failed about the refugees. It's just the same now.
Ivan, just on that question, I mean, I know the EU has often been Brussels has been a scapegoat for, this isn't the first time. But do you think, I mean, this is a completely different circumstance, and I guess it's hard to, gauge public opinion. But do you think, do you think is the public buying that messaging, or is it, and this will go to the question going to Andre next as well too, which is about Russian disinformation internally. Do you think that the government spin internally is being accepted? Because I think even here in the U.S., I think there are different actors that have stepped up to play, in some cases, more outspoken roles: governors, local leaders, others that have been out there contradicting, in some sense, some of the messaging coming directly, even from Washington. Do you think it's working?
I think we will know the answer to that question later. But what we are seeing right now, maybe Arbana just mentioned that, is that when China sends a plane, it is something you can see and you can touch. When Ursula von der Leyen says we are going to invest 2.7 trillion euros to fight the crisis, this is something that people cannot imagine at all. They cannot compare apples and pears. So maybe it's a communication problem, and the European Union is not responsible for the healthcare system. National healthcare systems are totally independent in the European Union. This is something people don't know. They do not understand because they don't know how the European Union is working. So maybe in the short term it will work. This is just my focus.
Yeah, short term versus long term, and I guess we really won't know because each country is going to go through their own challenges now and in the future. But it's something to good to know that you're going to be reporting on this from now until into the future. Andre, I want to bring you in. I had asked sort of initially about you saw both of your colleagues sort of raising, and Jamie highlighted it too, the role that Russia has been playing externally. And more often than not, the assistance provided seems to be propaganda. Sometimes it includes some equipment that isn't necessarily actually working, or that some of the you see in terms of disinformation. Arfi, by the way, if you haven't checked it out, did a great piece a few days back on some of these viral videos of Italians sort of singing the Russian national anthem, or it's kind of interesting. But Andre, just internally too, how is this playing out? If there's such a great need for medical equipment and other needs internally in Russia, how is this playing out internally in Russia? What are Russians hearing and seeing from their own government?
Look, Jonathan, your question takes me back to March 10th, when Vladimir Putin used to have a speech in State Duma, and after the speech it was absolutely obvious that Kremlin elite had taken decisions that Mr. Putin will govern Russia forever. So they didn't expect it, of course, such a big amount of coronavirus problems, and in a way they are in a kind of trap now. You have daily false news and disinformation from Russian government on daily basis. Just a last example is the news which was disseminated today is that British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is connected to ventilator and that he is barely alive still. It was denied immediately by Foreign Office. So you can find such things on daily basis. But in the ground lays a big idea that West is inept to confront this coronavirus because of its flag, what they call democracy. And Russia, with what Mr. Putin and Kremlin calls democracy, can't stand it. That's what is the difference. Everything is bad in the West just because it's West, just because they are building that society which is what they call democratic. We do it in another Russian way of doing things, and we have stability. We have national leader who can stand it all. So the whole system of Kremlin propaganda is, from my perspective, trying to play with this strategic mission. There are some problems for Kremlin, and these problems arise unexpectedly. For example, Mr. Putin, in his usual way, comes to a new built hospital in Moscow suburb, which is called Kommunarka. It's a new medical complex for infectional diseases, where people who are infected with coronavirus are there. Mr. Putin comes there and speaks to a chief surgeon of their clinics and shake hands with him. And this doctor turns out to be infected in a couple of days. And now Mr. Putin, who is 67 by age and who officially is denied to go out from his flat because he has an age which is prescribed as health organization, Russian medicine authorities, as to be too, so he is too old to go outside. So, and now he is a kind of self-isolation, sitting in his having home office and giving his orders only by telecoms. So it's not absolutely the style Russians want to see their leaders. That's why I've seen a question about a new game of power between him and between Moscow Mayor Sobyanin, who is 6 years Putin is 6 years older than Sobyanin, and between another big player is Mr. Mishustin, new prime minister, who is also younger than Putin. So Putin has to give part of his personality, I should say, to other people, just to make them do something to cope with this coronavirus. If they will be, if it will be mistake, they will be to blame. If they will win because they were governed by a mighty nation's leader. But overall, situation is such that the game they began before the beginning of coronavirus now has very murky perspective. So nobody can say whether population will support Putin in a couple of months if it will be a referendum for amendment of constitution, because of these kind of things, because of unknown price which is to be paid by Russian economy and Russian people of this coronavirus pandemic. So they behave themselves in their usual way. They're trying to build their internal agenda, trying to distract attention and telling people how bad things are outside the country. We are better than others. That's why we'll succeed. So we'll see how it will work. Over.
Andrei, are you seeing, just, from your reporters in the regions, obviously Moscow has been a central focus. What is the situation that you're hearing, from in terms of other major cities, in terms of responses there as well? Is it a showcase of, look what we're doing in Moscow, but we're not spreading the assistance further into regions? I mean, it's pretty clear that Russia's healthcare system has challenging issues, and had, even under the best of circumstances, the world's best health systems are challenged, in some cases really struggling. Can you just speak to that as well? Because I think we tend to focus a lot on capitals and what's happening in capitals. And maybe I can just turn back to a couple of the other speakers as well, talking about what's happening in local areas as well in other cities.
Yes, sure. Russia is a big country, as it's known, and it hugely depends on the might of given region. There are some regions where status of health facilities and the healthcare system is better than in others. But overall, by independent observers, Russian health system in the regions is treated as a disaster. So, and that is why there are a lot of questions important to local governors, to local mayors, whether they are now in a position to confront the coronavirus, to maintain stability in their cities. So situation differs from region to region, but what we get from our freelancers on the ground, mainly it's a shocking challenge to local authorities, and if coronavirus will come seriously, and as you pointed out, Russia, the wave of coronavirus is not still there. It's somewhere in Western Europe and in US, not in Russia. If the sound of coronavirus will be substantial, it would be a real catastrophe for a number of Russian regions. So we published a story about local journalist in Perm, it's a city in Urals, in Russian Urals, who had been died from coronavirus, and the lady has 36 years old, and it's by far our most popular piece for several years. We got over 1.5 million clicks on it. It's just about what you're asking. It's their situation in the local hospitals, how medicine system, medics, doctors, and nurses are prepared to confront it. It's not only the question whether they have enough masks, respirators, or ventilators. It's a system of the whole situation over the branch. So, and people are very worried. We'll see how it will go on, but it's a huge question for everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Also, I just want to remind people the Q&A is open right now. Please feel free to send in your questions. I wanted to turn to just asking both Ivan and Arbana too about the local coverage. And you know, one of the things that Andrei, I think you opened up sort of thinking about too is this issue of good governance. I mean, I think this really coronavirus in a very unfortunate way really exposes poor governance. I think in you know, this is countries where we're talking about corruption, which I'll ask in a second too, because I had somebody was asking a question, sent me a question before the session about the challenges of doing exactly what you're doing, which is when, you know, how do you, you know, when do you start to, or are you shifting to cover some of the issues that you covered before? What I heard Ivan say too is, you know, it's coronavirus, you know, 100% of the time. When do you make that shift? Are you making that shift to really focus on some of these other issues? But maybe I could go back to Ivan first, just to talk a little bit more about local response and how you're seeing resources and reporting from local. And then we had a question that I'll raise again to many of you about corruption in this, you know, in shedding light on a period of real darkness. Arbana, can I just hand it over to you just to talk about what you're seeing across the Balkans?
So on the local level, well, I think Jamie touched upon it at the beginning, and Ivan also mentioned it during. So we're trying to be more of a public service to our audience, just so that to offer them basic information in the times of need. And how does this content look like? Ivan is correct. 100% of our content is like coronavirus. Yes, they're interested in political crisis in our regions, but coronavirus tops all of it, and our numbers speak best. I mean, we have tripled our presence in digital platforms across all 5 countries. There's also just during the weekend, the European Federation of Journalists has issued a pretty harsh statement on media in Kosovo, for example, one example, to refrain from intensifying tensions in a health crisis. And they actually, the Federation actually named media connected or close to both Kosovo President Hashim Thaçi and Serbia's President Aleksandar Vučić. And this is a quote, I'm quoting the statement. It seems clear that some politicians, starting with Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić and the President of Kosovo, Hashim Thaçi, are using the coronavirus crisis to inflame political and social tensions in their own interest. So it's pretty much sensationalist journalism going after news, I don't want to call them news items which look like news, they're not fact-checked, and they panic inciting either on different solutions, how you can cure yourself, or the narration that we spoke until now coming from mostly from Kremlin-sponsored media or China-sponsored media. So it really makes our presence in the region very important in how we mobilize all our teams and efforts. Balkan Service has 5 bureaus. So all of the bureaus are actually working from homes because they have state of emergencies and curfews that we have to follow through. But we also serve there for something that we like to call inspirational stories, positive stories. There's one story that we're going to do tomorrow, and this is from city of Mostar in Bosnia, which has been divided since the end of the war. The Bosniaks and Croats there literally have a divided city with hospitals, and coronavirus joined the city. They have even opened a makeshift hospital, named it COVID-19, and we're going to have, it's really inspirational story. We're going to publish it tomorrow. So our role is also getting and advocating for the best out there.
Thank you, and I think it's important too. I guess we spent a lot of time focused on the bad things that are happening, but also really important to see areas of cooperation. Those people who are stepping up to play important roles of bringing communities together, which is something you also are doing as well. The reporting is about also shedding light on those people who are stepping up. Ivan, I wanted to know if you wanted to maybe just step in on sort of the local again, or is there anything that you wanted to add to that you think is important, because you're the voice of those on the ground in some sense. And I like how you said, you're almost playing a public service role at this point, and helping to provide information. And so I wanted to ask you about the local, but also many people, it's hard, you guys work with a lot of different experts, but it's also hard to kind of, obviously this is a pandemic, and it's very technical too, in terms of the do's and don'ts. When you're a public service, you're talking to people about things such as, how this virus might be spread, how to prevent. And I just wanted to maybe ask too about sort of the relationships, or how you're supplementing your own information with that of experts, and who you're relying on to ensure that you have the right medical information.
Thank you, Jonathan. You mentioned experts, so we're very careful because these days people like to listen to experts. And there are really many experts who, one of them will say there is no coronavirus at all. Another one will say, I have the cure, I have the vaccine in my backyard, so things like that. So we're very careful. Of course, we talk to experts, but really very careful. So we don't want to give very high hopes to people, ungrounded hopes, or on the other side, we don't want to frighten them. We try to stay somewhere in the middle, only with the facts. And before that, we asked about the local situation. So in terms of containing the coronavirus, the authorities look good. The situation looks good so far. The problems come from the chaos they're creating. and the chaos is raising anxiety, and people are more and more nervous and really don't know what to do. So this is what we are trying to deal with. Bulgarian healthcare system and educational system are not modernized. They are very socialist type old systems. And the good news is that most of the teachers, they have turned to distance learning process overnight without any program that was developed before. So they had to improvise, and we have published a number of stories of great teachers who really improvise. They just use Zoom as we are using now, and started teaching, and they're doing. The second, the biggest problem I see is the economic response, because Bulgarian government is not so generous as other governments, and they are not providing support for self-employed people or for businesses. They're providing loans. So that's why we publish a number of stories with small business representatives and owners. We want them to be heard, and in the same time, I think we are helping. It's not our primarily goal, but we are helping the government by publishing stories like this. We are shaping their decisions, because they really are frightened. They're afraid. They're chaotic now. They don't know what to do because they have never done this before, and they read everything. And by giving floor to real people with real problems, in the end of the day, we may help again.
Thank you, Andrei. Can I ask you too, just on the question of just, and thank you for pointing out, I think how, individuals, school teachers I know here, even in Washington, I thank the ground every day that we have such dedicated teachers, working with families who are now at home. But Andrei, just on your end too, where you see or stories of people that are stepping up. And I think particularly, I emphasize that I think that in Russia is a very difficult situation, but I'm certain that public understands that there's a need based even on this switch and how the government has approached this issue from a little over 2 weeks ago to where we are today. Is there anything that you wanted to point out as a positive example of approach in Russia that you've seen?
Yep, sure. As in other countries, there is a whole wave of public support to people, of friendly assistance, of neighboring assistance, of volunteer movements, of young people who help to older people to survive in these difficult circumstances. And we, of course, pinpoint these examples, and we have a special crew devoted to these things, and we make a kind of different regional studies on the matter, how this volunteer movements is organized in different regions of Russia. So it does work. It's a new wave of, by the way, it's not only done by civil society, it's also done, there are a number of pro-governmental organization, pro-Kremlin organization which do this job. If this job is good, it's not a pretext for us to criticize Mr. Putin. If he does some good things, we say that it's good. But overall, of course, and I do share opinion of my colleagues that every positive example is worthy to be mentioned. And there is another very important point which was noticed by Jamie at the beginning, that we do provide people with a lot of basic health information. And we have this practice across the board in the company. On each day, regular basis, we disseminate information provided by World Health Organization, for example, or other respectable offices of the agencies of the world, which can give people not only expertise, but some concrete knowledge how they should behave themselves in this situation. It's very important because it's one of the key messages which media now should disseminate to the people. I do agree with Ivan that it's rather, we should be very careful with experts, because you never know, especially in these very specialized topics like epidemiology or coronavirus dissemination, is he saying some worse information or not. But information which is approved by international bodies like World Health Organization is worth to be presented to people.
Great, thank you, Andrei. We're running up close to the end of the virtual event, and what I wanted to just do, if we could, and we'll start with Jamie first, is maybe just for a final word. And but before we even start, I just want to say thank you to all of you for for speaking and for joining. And I think this last round of questions about information, providing the right type of information given the pandemic and how critical it is, and you're all doing that. And I appreciate what you said, which is when governments do the right thing, that should be highlighted. When governments don't do the right thing, that also has to be highlighted as well. That's the only way we're all going to be able to address this challenge going forward. And whatever happens in spaces like Russia or in the Balkans or Bulgaria, it has a direct impact because this is a pandemic, a global pandemic that impacts all of us. Jamie, if I could just turn to you for closing thoughts, and I just, again, thank you so much for you and for your team for joining us here today. So can I just turn it over to you if there's any final thoughts on the role of RFERL and challenges?
Sure, and thanks to you, Jonathan, and to Karen and the team for making this happen. I just want to pick up on a couple things that others on my team highlighted earlier. One interesting angle for an American audience, and although I assume there's also a bit of a transatlantic audience maybe dialing in, even though it's late in the day here in Europe. Honestly, in the last several weeks of our coverage, I've personally probably seen a lot more disinformation aimed at the EU than I have aimed at the US. And so I think it's just important to note, because often some of these conversations become a US-Russia or a US-China debate. But the EU, as I think some of my colleagues highlighted, has really been targeted significantly, certainly across Eurasia in the messaging that we've seen, not just by Russia, but also the Chinese. And some of that targeting has really just tried to create more rifts between EU member states, pit them against each other, raise fundamental questions about the future of the EU, which is an easier conversation, I think, to start right now, given that we're all locked down within national borders and things like Schengen have kind of gone out the window, at least temporarily. So that's an interesting angle, which I think our audience should be aware of. Another piece is what Andrei highlighted, is that the Russians in particular, but I think the Chinese and others are really trying to make this a debate about authoritarianism, or at least their version, which they would obviously not call authoritarianism, their version of democracy, supposed democracy, with Western style democracy. And that's a theme that I think we've seen in many places. And I think that should be very concerning, certainly to an audience in Washington, but also the audience in Brussels. Even as we in the West are struggling ourselves with this challenge, I think we need to start thinking about what comes next. And this pandemic, even after there's a vaccine or the worst effects of it fade, will have raised fundamental questions about our system of governance. It's going to create a lot of questions and raise doubt in a lot of our citizens' minds about certain institutions, certainly government institutions, but even some private institutions, in some countries, the media. These are weighty issues, which I think we're going to have to grapple with. And in the true spirit of the German Marshall Fund, and given its history related to the Marshall Plan and Germany's appreciation for the Marshall Plan, I think it's a moment to begin to think about, as Ursula von der Leyen has been talking about, what is the new Marshall Plan and what does it look like? And on that, I mean, I think I would just urge transatlantic audiences to think about our role and the independent media's role in that, because I think even before this crisis, the information space was unfortunately being neglected by many Western capitals. But I do think independent media, and I think the coronavirus pandemic is showing this more than ever, play an essential role in many of these either developing democracies or authoritarian regimes. And, you know, I'd like to see European and American leaders really work together to do more to support independent media going forward. And so, you know, we're going to continue to do our work. This is our year of anniversaries, not just our, as I mentioned, our 25th anniversary here in Prague. It's our 70th anniversary overall. And even as institutions and others come under attack, I think we're pretty confident, based on what we've seen, that our audiences will continue to come to our brand, because I think for that entire time, all 7 decades, our brand has been known for our objectivity and our independence. And so we're just going to continue to abide by that during these moments of crisis, in the hope that we can continue to play our role going forward after the world moves beyond these difficult times.
Jamie,
so thanks again for hosting us.
Thank you, and Andre and Ivan and Bana, thank you. We're at the end of we've hit our break point. I think on those last words about the long-term impact and the need to think about what's going to come next, and there will be all sorts of fallout from this over a period that we don't fully understand yet, but we deeply appreciate what RFE-RL is doing and has been doing for so many decades. You've been in and out of these challenges and crisis before, so it's deeply appreciated. We view you as the front lines of these issues, and clearly from hearing from Arbana, Ivan, and Andre too, we know exactly, we get a better sense on the ground in specific countries and regions what's happening. And on behalf of Karen Donfried, president of GMF, myself, and my colleagues, we want to thank everybody for joining today. And we'll be able to share the video of this as well. And so if those that didn't catch the beginning of it want to look back and refer to it, you'll be able to see it. But just Jamie, thank you again. Everybody keep safe, keep healthy, and we look forward to our next conversation. And I also want to just quickly thank John Alexander, my colleague behind the scenes, and Martins with RFE in Washington for also helping pull this together. A lot of people are working behind the scenes to make this happen. Jamie, thank you.
Thanks,
Take
John.
care. Keep safe. Bye.